I saw in Rav Kook in his Agada, and it was like too good of an inspiration. The actual words that like led to the development of the thought won't seem as inspiring, but the idea I thought was just very appropriate to talk about before Pesach. So let's begin. So, in order to fully enter into the idea that we're going to discuss, by way of introduction, I saw in Rav Soloveitchik's book called Out of the Whirlwind. I'm sure some of you have seen it based on previous chaburas. It seems like a read that people here would have read. And he makes there's like two paragraphs on Pesach in there. One of them is about memory and about the command, I think in the Rambam, or maybe elsewhere, that on Pesach night we have to see ourselves as if we personally are going out and feel that we are going out of Mitzrayim. And he says that memory is not just a recall of events. Memory is an experiential thing. It's supposed to bring something alive. It brings alive events from the past. It's not just we sit around by a campfire, singing songs and recalling yesteryear, the days of yore. But what it is when you do speak about the events and when you do think about them, you're feeling the same feelings or similar feeling, and you're experiencing the memory. And I think that happens in two ways. That happens from an external perspective and an internal perspective. That happens based on the way the world comes at us and wants us to feel, and then also happens from the way we internally want to experience and want to remember and want to feel the world. So Pesach obviously is the holiday of freedom. Rav Kook called this time of year famously the Aviv HaOlam, the springtime. Aviv HaOlam, Aviv HaHistori, the springtime of history. That when we were freed from Mitzrayim, that time of then for the future generations until Mashiach comes will always be a time of rebirth, regrowth. Newness, the time where you personally, collectively can be freed. And he talks about two types of freedom. We'll see it's in the first source, but we'll just introduce it and then we'll read it. A physical freedom and a spiritual, but also a psychological freedom. The physical freedom is external based. I'm a free man. I'm not someone's slave. I'm not in shackles. You look at me and you're like, that man is free. And then there's the other type of freedom, the non-physical freedom, which is a freedom that's not based on your surroundings. You can be in slavery, but you can be free. It's the mindset of freedom. So those are the two. We're gonna, as we go along, we're gonna continuously build upon different steps. So memory as an experience being the first step, and now this two-pronged freedom of physical and spiritual, psychological freedom is another important step to understand ultimately at the end what the message is going to be of, as I titled it, the son who's just waiting to ask, the personal freedom that we're all striving and searching for. So if we just take a look at this first source. So El Hashanim HaMisamenim, this is from Olas Raya, it's from the Haggadah of Rav Kook. It's the first thing, it's his intro to Pesach freedom would be your chametz. El Hashanim HaMisamenim Lanu Es Chag HaGeula Chag HaPesach Zman Cheresenu. These years or these times this time is known of the year is known as the Chag HaGeula, Zman Cheretenu L'Dorus. I'm just going to read a lot and then we'll summarize because it's long. L'doros ma'anachnu lamadim me'ile. Shnei hanosim halu hatzulim zeh b'zeh. So we want to basically look into two things that come out of this this freedom, this chagagula, chagazman cheritenu, and see if they're dependent on one another. Hatshuva hanitzchis hi shetanai hagula shana mehema acheres ha'atzmis cheres haguf mikol shibud zar mikol shibud hakofes tzelem elokim asher ba'adam lios meshubad l'chol koach asher hu morid es ercho es teferes gdulaso v'hadarta kocho v'acheres hazos eno niknes. So there's this type of freedom that is the freedom that comes by revealing what he says, revealing the Tzelem Elokim in a person. And that freedom only comes about via the neshama, the soul, the internal of a person. Cheres haruach mikoma shehu mata oso misilasa hayeshara vayetana hayitzug mahus atmis aval ele shnei sugi acheres einam bayim eina adam betur ishios pratis lo ha'am betur kibbutz shalim baruch miyuchad zochel lahem kiyem al yedei habir mikol gvulo es kol devar hamaakev es cheruso shezeo chemtzo hasur shabisa sheziko biyoser be'eith asher or shal geula mitnotzitz alav. Lehit lamed. This is where we begin to differentiate. Lehit lamed. Anu tzrichem eich l'sagel lanu es oso ruach hagadol sha'acheres. Asher zarach aleinu amnam betkufo sameiro shalanu. Asher yatsa kivarak notzatz behofasa shalagula harishona. Gulas mitzrayim asher nigla aleinu melech machem lachem kadosh baruch hu. Bechvodo hagadol kirbeinu lavodaso shehi cherusenu hagemur v'harim osanu. Mashplosa shel avdos hanachri asher shave hi avodaso. So basically, what he's saying is that this freedom took root in the redemption from Mitzrayim, where God came and basically gave us a complete redemption from our slavery, our mental slavery, our physical slavery in Mitzrayim. But however, the difference between a slave and a free man, between being in Mitzrayim and being out of Mitzrayim, between being, being pre Emancipation Proclamation, after whatever the equal in each state or whatever in each country, in each locale. The difference is a status difference. He's a free man. He's a slave. It's physical. It's totally physical. It has nothing to do with the mindset of a person. This man's free. This man's not. Masha b'mikra zeh hu meshubad la'achar v'zeh hu bilti meshubad. The difference is that he is free, and then afterwards he's not free. So we left Mitzrayim, so we're no longer slaves. That's the difference. We're no longer slaves. Obviously, it's much deeper. We're going to see, but from the outside looking in, that's all that changed. The shackles are removed. You're a free man. You got free from jail. That's all that really changes. However, we're able to find the slave, an Evan Maskil, which is like a very interesting term that he uses, just an intelligent slave, an Eved, a thinking slave, which is funny because if you think about slavery, at least the most recent form, American slavery, it was dealing with unintelligent people, or at least slave owners tried to convince the slave population that they were unintelligent people by the fact that they weren't educated. And what does that do if you're unintelligent? You're a slave. He's smarter than me. He knows better. I can't be free. But what an Evan Maskil, sherucho hu malecheres, his spirit is filled with freedom. Lehefech ben chorim sherucho hu ruach shal eved. Sorry, we rushed through the first part. The first part was basically just the physical freedom. Now we're getting in. This is the ikar of what I want to focus on for the going forward. So, you'll find a free man whose spirit is the spirit of slavery. You don't have to walk far in the world to find someone who is free and comfortable, but yet is enslaved. His mindset's enslaved. Right here, you can find me. I'm one of those men. Hacheres hatzivyonis, he also haruach hanosa. שהאדם וכן העם בכלל מתרומם על ידו להיות נאמן לעצמיוס הפנימי שלו לתכונה הנפשית של צלם אלוקים אשר בקרבו. The character of freedom is when a person is able to look inside and not see himself as a slave. For us, for not even for Jews, for people, he didn't say for a Jew. It comes with recognizing the Tzalmei Elokim, recognizing the godly in everyone and everything. If people realize that in the world, then you wouldn't have slavery. You wouldn't have a Holocaust. It wouldn't happen. But when you're able to remove, when people aren't able to turn inward and see that in themselves, so then they could be free as a bird, but yet they're in a cage, flying around, but unaware that they're not going anywhere. However, if you're able to look inward and see that, then it's infinite where your mind can go, where your potential can go, where you can go. You could feel it, because the feeling is something that could be infinite. I think. Shehem shavim es erkom. Ma she'ein came bebal haruach shel avdus shel olam ein tochin chayav v'hergasha me'irim b'tchunos ha'nafshus ha'azmis ki im b'ma shehu tov v'yafe eitz al ha'achar ha'sholit alav eze shlita shehi bein shehi Rishimas ben shehi musaris. B'ma she'achar moti shehu yafe v'tov. And the opposite is obviously a person can have infinite resources and never move outside of his daled can never feel that his infinite capability can reach beyond the extension of his arm. That's the mindset. The difference between someone who's intellectually free, that's free, the character of freedom, and someone who's not. The character of physical freedom is I can now move wherever I want to go. The character of physical slavery is you're confined to a certain space. The character of spiritual freedom is I'm able to go wherever I want to go, spiritually, personally, internally, the panemius. And the character of panemius slavery is I could have every advantage, every possibility in the world, and yet I feel like I can go nowhere. So they're the same characteristics, and yet they manifest themselves in two ways: a physical way and a spiritual way. Geulenu shgalnu Hashem Yisbarach v'galas avosinu mitzrayim lecheres olam. Bo na achim al haseder kulanu yivada lanu shehinenu b'nei malachim. V'am shehacherus. So everything's dependent on recognizing this Tzalmei Elokim. Recognizing, and I want to kind of remove it from there because it's not going to necessarily be something on Tzalmei Elokim, but Tzalmei Elokim is, at least the way I was reading it, was the way of turning to yourself, to get to know yourself, to be with yourself, to be the panemi. When you realize who you truly are is in the image of God. So by recognizing your Tzalmei Elokim is just recognizing who you truly are.
And that you're infinite?
Yeah, but that's
Like, how does that relate to the ability to be free? That once you recognize someone who came inside.
Well, I think it's just recognizing your godliness, your godly soul, or your godly capabilities. So you now no longer feel confined to a certain, roadmap. Your feeling is I can do anything. Impossible is nothing. That's what you feel. In a non-delusional way, in like a healthy, normal. If I put my mind to something, I can conquer and do anything, because you're like in tune with God, in a way. I think. I mean, I was just reading. That's not important for right now. I don't want to say something that it's not fully thought out, or I don't, But I think it comes from recognizing San Elokim, the Pinimitz. He said he was talking about a feeling. And I mentioned infinite in terms of feeling, because if you feel something, when you feel elated and ecstatic, or you feel depressed, both of those feelings are like, you're in the infinity of those feelings. Like you're depressed, you feel like there's no other way but down.
Right. You're
elated about something, there's no other way but up. You're just constantly soaring and going, So with the feeling of freedom, even though you're enslaved, you're able, you're able to go with the feeling as long as it can take you. But also the infinity I was referring to was just being outside of your borders. Slavery is within borders, and freedom is outside of borders, or control of your borders. You can go wherever you want to go. That's it's touching on infinite. Even if you only go within 5 feet, the fact that you can and have the ability and the option to go anywhere, I can choose to go anywhere, and yet I choose to remain here. That's still beyond borders, even though you're only moving 5 feet, let's say. But that's like a discussion for another time. It could be you. It's calling you name. Okay. I was still sweating from that freaking spicy hot dog.
Sorry. Yeah. I think one time we said in from Cook, what's the book he has in Agadata? It's called? Anaya. That he said, why do we have a Seder at night if we actually left Mitzrayim during the day? We should have the Seder during the day when we left. So there he says something like, the Iker of the Gula is in your mind, your mindset. So you could be in Mitzrayim, like you said, and be completely free. So they were still in Mitzrayim at that time at night, but that's when we celebrate the holiday.
Yeah, that's what I really want to focus on, is that we're dealing with two types of freedom, but really this second freedom where you can be free in a place that isn't free is ultimately, at least for me, was a totally new. It's something you try for all year, and then come Pesach, you throw it out the window and revert back to physical freedoms and slaveries, and being enslaved to taivas and different things, and then thinking about Mitzrayim is totally just, we walked out the door and now we're free. And I was struck and shocked myself that I spent the whole year thinking about and trying to find freedom within exile and a place of constriction. And come Pesach, for years it was always let's forget that, we're now in Pesach, and kind of revert, like an addict reverting back to his ways of just enslaving myself further by not realizing that Pesach is, because we're having the Seder in Teaneck, New Jersey. That's not physical redemption, but yet to feel redemption. It's a nice place. It's nice, that's so
It's like California.
So okay. Bo no achim last paragraph. I'll say there. Kolono yivada lanu shehininu b'nei malachim v'am shechiros he goreli hanitzchi lo avad Yisrael v'lo yilid bayis v'lo yehei lavos me'az asher nasa b'rama miyom chag chirosinu as degel hachirus u'bir hachametz asher yavo kamayim v'karbenu Shem ba'atzmosenu al yidei koach ha'isanim shel ha'mafal ha'kadosh v'aneman b'kaimenu es devar Hashem goel Yisrael ve'olam ve'adolam asher tzivonu l'shmor es ha'matzos shomu es ha'cheres es ha'bir ha'chometz ve'higalu mehira gulu Hashem. That was just to finish the paragraph, but we're not going to get into bir chometz and matzah and that stuff. But what I want to leave with this paragraph is the notion of physical freedom, two expressions of freedom: physical and spiritual, psychological freedom. And I was just because the movie messed me up so much that I figured I would from 12 Years a Slave. Anyone see it here?
Yeah, it's very intense.
So it kind of was like preparing this helped in terms of like thinking about the movie and the messages versus just being totally like freaked out by how and how bad slave owners were, and deciding that I'm not spending any time in Gehenna because Gehenna is reserved for people like that and Nazis. So we're all good here. We're all
right.
Safe. Good. But he said, who saw it here? Okay, so for those who didn't, the scene is that they're at this plantation. The owner is a relatively nice guy. It's somewhat towards the beginning of the movie. Sorry, spoiler alert. He's what would be known as a nice plantation slave owner. Like he himself, he doesn't overwork anyone. He treats them nicely, But there are others who are working in there, who are mid-level managers, who feel like get a little power hungry, and so this guy Solomon, he's like the guy who the story's about. He's coming back from work one day, and this woman who's living in like the slave houses, she's like bawling, she's in tears because they separated her from her children when they were selling them at the slave trade block, and she won't she's hysterical, and they're gonna send her off or kill her, if she doesn't shut up. So she says to him, "How can you not be like this when you're in this situation? How can you go on with your life and your day and not that he's smiling, but in a way smiling because he's not hysterical when he's literally shackled to someone's property?" And he says this. He says, this is very powerful. He says, "I survive. I will not fall into despair. I will offer my talents up to Mr. Ford. I will keep myself hardy till freedom is opportune. I don't want to survive. I want to live." This guy lives. He's aware that he's a slave. He's aware that his physical reality is slavery. But not that what he's unaware of, what he won't recognize is that he has control over his mental slavery, over whether he knows he's not a slave. He actually was a free man, but he knows this isn't the way people are supposed to be. So he refuses to allow the physical reality to dictate to him what he's going to see himself as. Doesn't comfort her at all, but that point that she doesn't get comfort is very important for what we're going to see about the four sons and the four questions. So, Rav Kook elsewhere, later on, he talks about the four questions. So we have this notion of physical and spiritual freedom, and it translates very well into the four questions, but less the four questions and more the four sons. So he, in trying to answer why the questions are ordered as they are, because if you think about it, they should be the opposite order, or at least it should start with the biggest deviation, the greatest deviation from the normal order of things, if the point is to get people to ask questions, to get the children to ask questions. So you should start with leaning, because leaning is different than, people don't always lean when they eat. Other things, even matzah, or greens, even those things, you might come to eat it during the year, you might come, But when people eat, you sit down, you eat, or you sit on the floor, whatever you eat. You're not leaning. So if you pick up where is everyone's underline? Yeah. Right? Pick up the underline. It says, "Ach be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach farish ki ha'she'ilos ha'ilu miyusados al ben she'ena yodei lishol ki al ha'chacham v'hashar in sarich l'sar she'os." For everyone except the she'ena yodei lishol. It's what? We're still like we're right here next to it. He says for those, they don't need the questions there. They don't need, to ask, because they'll come to questions on their own. They'll see something. The Chacham, or the Rasha even, or the Tam, they'll see matzah, and even though it's not such a deviation, they'll know this isn't normal. So they'll ask on it. But the She'ena Yodei, he needs questions in order for him to be aware of what's going on. So kihem ba'atzum yishalo v'rak al she'ena yodei she'ata tiftach lo nizdar lo she'os l'chein hitzchil she'yiftach lo Pesach shalosh ma'amat. So we start with something that's not so different than the rest of the year. So in order that he might think, start to think oh, what else is different, or what else should I ask? And then eventually we're going to get and then we save the most wondrous thing that we're I think leaning, right? Yeah. For the end, because the main thing is for him to come to the questions on his own. So we give him help, and eventually when he doesn't get it, it's you kind of yell at, you pick up a megaphone, and you're like, dude, say something. We're here for you. We were hired for you. So the purpose of the questions is to get him to come up with questions, but also for him to ask questions ba'atzmo, from himself. So we see a difference between the first sons and the last son, the first three. The first three, the Chacham, Rasha, and Tam, they are able to ask questions. They don't need these exterior questions, these questions about what's happening in front of their eyes, because they're experts in asking questions, in seeing the world and being like, that's weird, I should think about that. They're like the guys who walk down the street, see a homeless man and go that's not right, and wonder why no one's helping him. They react to physical reality. The She'ena Yodei just sits there, brooding, and you're like, this guests come and think something's wrong with him. You don't want to say something because you think maybe they're he has a disability. You're sitting at the table weirded out by him. He's quiet, but for him, the way I look at him is he's not entertained by what's happening in front of his eyes, by what's going on in the world. He's more interested in himself and what's his role in the world and what he's doing. So he's not a She'ena Yodei, he's just a She'ena Yodei in terms of what the world sets up for him. We want him to ask questions on what's happening at the Seder, so we set up questions for him. But yet he still doesn't ask. Rav Kook doesn't say that we did this, and then at the end of the Seder, that son got up and asked. We do this, but yet he still doesn't ask. Yet the Chacham, the Tam, and the Rasha are all blabbing and giving their nice Dvar Torahs at the table, and after many years, you're you want to kill them. But yet this She'ena Yodei is sitting there, internally laughing, at what's going on outside, and being he's thinking those deep, thoughtful questions of what is my role in this world? What am I going to do that's going to fix the world? What's my share in doing? And the way I saw that's not, he doesn't say that. That's totally just like a reading on the four sons. But the bottom underline was what led to this whole thought was Lefi Divarenu Ela Nichami Madua Lama Eno Shoel Gam Kenal Dalat Kostas. Rav Kook wants to know, why don't we ask on the 4 cups of wine? That should be an obvious question if our whole mahalach, at least according to Rav Kook, is to get questions flowing, especially from those who don't react to the outside world. Ki darkam haya lishtos yain gam kodem suda v'achar suda v'gam betoch suda, because the way of the world was then to drink before, in the middle, and after a suda. Every suda had that. It wasn't different. The symbolism of the 4 kosos was different on this night, but the actual drinking was not. K'mosh kasu Mishnah Brachos. Perach Ketzan Varchim Yain Shel Lifnei Hamazon Poter Shel Achar Hamazon Kol Shel Bracha Hayu Shosim Achar Suda. That I'm not gonna lie, that wasn't the line that inspired me. L'chein Ein Shaykh Kol Kach L'Shol Zeh L'Shein L'Shol. So he says L'chein Ein Shaykh Kol Kach L'Shol Zeh L'Shein. So therefore we don't put this question out there for the Shein L'Shol. Ki bevadai lo yispal mizeh, because he won't be mispal from it. Ki enenu roa v'zeh shinoi, because it doesn't look different from him. But the way I thought, I read that and I thought about it, and I thought 2 things. One, there are questions that are brought about via what's happening in front of our eyes, and there are questions that are brought about what's happening inside our hearts. There are questions that things deviate or things stay the same, and we react. And then there are those who are comfortable and I don't know, I'm blanking on the right word. Comfortable and blank. Audacious, daring to not look at the world outside, turn inside, view God's world. And not to say that this isn't God's world as well, but to look inside of that Tselem Elokim inside and ask the personal, quasi-existential questions of what's my life, how can I help people, and stuff like that. And the fact that this whole thing was set up for the She'el Dei L'Shol to ask, and we don't incorporate the Dalet Kosos because he won't see it and react to it, means that I saw as like this is like a proof. I don't know if I was looking for a proof, but that there are questions that happen before our eyes and questions that happen inside. And the fact that the other 3 sons don't need the questions because they react to the world. They don't need to be asked. They don't need they don't need to be the ones to ask. But shows that the Shein L'Ishol, he's not retarded. He's like a person. He's just a quiet individual who's nervous to speak. He has a speech impediment or whatnot. So that means that there's stuff going on inside that he's thinking about. But the stuff outside that changes, doesn't change, just really doesn't bother him. He's like, this is the world. This is how the world works. This is okay. So he goes here, I go here, I do this, he does that. But none of that affects what I'm going to do for the world. None of that affects the questions of who am I and what am I going to do and how am I going to... And those questions ultimately are the questions of personal freedom. The other questions, matzah, maror, why do we suffer, stuff like that. Even though we'll see, that's also, Eli Wiesel thinks that's in this other type. Those questions are more about the collective freedom of the Jewish people. But the personal freedom of each person, of each Jew, each person in the world, comes via almost disregarding what's happening around me and thinking about myself in a non-selfish way, but how my role in this world is going to change and better the world and fix the world. So, the She'ein L'Dei Lishol is really, I think, is the type who's bothered by the second type of question, the internal personal question and not the external collective question. Both are totally necessary and fine, and the synthesis is what's needed to care about the collective and to care about the personal. That's necessary for ultimate redemption, because you could be personally redeemed and yet we're sitting in the Seder and Teaneck and we're not collectively redeemed, you know? So the synthesis of both of those is what's necessary for the ultimate redemption. But we have these two types of questions, the explicit and it's not implicit, but it's more personal. And take a look at, it's the last page 3 of Steinsaltz. Along with the question, you know, not necessarily, what I hope doesn't come out of this is that we need to have an answer necessarily to those questions. But what I really am trying to focus on, and I hope it's clear, and if it's not, I apologize, is that there's the personal, and then there's the collective, and there's the external, and then there's the internal. It's less about the questions and answers, because that's a game of ends, you know. So I have the answer to my question now, and what happens if I'm still here? And I, you know. So
it sounds like from the Haggadah, it's not. They don't. Maybe there are answers, but it doesn't. It's not like this is the answer to question 1. It's a long.
It's literally just questions.
Yeah.
You know, you could say that the answer to those questions is Magid, but it doesn't necessarily answer. Even when you get to Pesach, Matzah, Maror, and those things, you're not answering the question. You would almost feel like the teacher who's dancing around your question. You know. So it can't. I don't think it's about the answer. But Rav Steinsaltz said something amazing in his Conversations. It's in the back of Strife and Spirit. You see, I am in a certain way not so very much interested in a man. Oh, you woke him up?
No, go. He just does this anyway.
Bring him out. By the way, did you see Jimmy Fallon? He had this great bit where he Broadway sang rap bits. Check it out. Snoop and 50.
It came out.
Oh my god, it was the funniest thing in the world.
I'll check it out.
Stalling for Isaac. Genuinely interested in that as well, but so he says, you see, I am in a certain way not so very much interested in man's search for himself. It is done by psychologists, better or worse. What I am speaking about then was a Jew and his connection with his own traditions. Whether he has some knowledge or he doesn't have some knowledge of them, there comes a time when he has to re-meet and re-understand his tradition in a way that will be applicable to him and say something to him as he is. You see, every person has to, at some time, recreate Sinai for himself. He himself has to accept the law. There's a very famous saying, and a very old one, that the law was given so many years ago, but it was not accepted at the time, at least not by everyone. So I am speaking about the experience of completing what was given at Sinai by receiving. And receiving is always a very personal thing. For some people it may be mystical and perhaps a shattering and destructive experience. Others may do it in a very easy way without any pain. But for everyone, it is a new feeling of meeting again, or for meeting for the first time. It says, you know, there's a verse from Psalms, I know that God is V'nei Yadati Gadol Hashem. So we all know he says something very slightly different. We all know what Rav Nachman says about that sometimes you can't even tell, you don't even know God to like yourself. There's their points that you can't tell to other people what God means to you, but there's also, you can't, you know, say what God means to you. But more of the beginning part, that the Har Sinai experience of Kimu V'Kiblu, going back to Pesach, Purim a little, is that it's teaching us that in the future, in the constant future, meaning every moment, we're going to have to like recreate for ourselves, you know, the Har Sinai experience, the meeting like with God experience, not necessarily every moment to have an intense one, but it comes a time in a person's life where he has to, and that kind of touches on every point that we've said so far, with in terms of memory, in terms of freedoms, in terms of what it means to be external, internal, collective, and personal. That everything happens in a two-pronged way. There's the Mitzrayim, and then there's Mashiach. Mitzrayim, as Rav Kook said in the beginning, that Mitzrayim became this time in the world where it was the springtime of the world. So Mitzrayim happened, and it finished, but it didn't really finish. How did it finish? When we collectively will recreate in a way, or not reenact, but recreate the Mitzrayim experience for us with Mashiach Tzidkenu. So I think that also happens with us in a personal space, that whatever happened collectively to us as a people will happen personally to us as a people, as individuals. So just like collective freedom and collective redemption happens, so too personal freedom and personal redemption is is within our grasp, is definitely able to be had by us, and to think not. But this notion of questions, we were talking about questions and answers. How does the four sons and the questions and all that, really relate to freedom? If you think about it, when you start to question yourself in life, that's when you feel the least free. When you start to think about what I want to do with my life, that's where at least I do. I feel like paralyzed. And we just spoke about for however long, saying how asking those questions is the personal freedom. The She'eno De'elishal sitting there, look like he's not asking, he's not as interested, who's really thinking about these questions. Yet in reality, we know that that's sometimes the most enslaved mindset we could be in, of constantly questioning our lives. If you look in the first back of the first page from the Nazir, it's a little difficult because he kind of writes fragmented. But there is in English. I only brought one copy. So he actually says why freedom, why questions in itself are the true expression of freedom, and that will hopefully crystallize the things we've said, if they've been clear up until now. If not, at least I gave a chabura. So according to Kabbalah, on this night, the Israelites went out of the 50 gates of impurity and entered the 50 gates of understanding. They went from the Shari Tumah and entered the Shari Bina. The Exodus is mentioned 50 times in the Torah, but the consciousness of the 50 gates of understanding was like a lightning bolt that appears on the intellectual horizon for a single night and then disappears. This is echoing, he's quoting from Zohar and other sources, but he's also echoing Rav Kook. If you've learned Rav Kook, at least on Oris HaTshuva, he talks about two ways of tshuva, the gradual and the lightning bolt. Subsequently, we would have to earn it back gradually, day by day, level by level, until on Shavuot, Pentecost, the 50th day since Passover, the 50 gates of understanding would be once again ours. Tonight, all 50 gates of understanding will be open wide, but they will close again afterward and open for us slowly, one by one, throughout the days of counting, Sephirah, until the time of giving of our Torah on the festival of Shavuot. In the Zohar, the essence of Bina is a question. In fact, the number 50 may be expressed in Hebrew as the question, me, who? And if you look in this, he says, did I photocopy there again? Yeah, he says the second underline, Ukein haben shoel, ma nishtana, she'ela ha'miyuchedes l'bina, habina shoeles, mi ma im, mi hu asur dekayama l'she'ela. Bina is the place of questioning, that atar dekayama tadir l'she'ela. Bina is known, Bina, the place of freedom, is known as the place of questioning. The 50th gate also symbolizes the world of freedom, the Alma de Herut. on the 50th year, the Yovel, the Jubilee, the slaves would be set free. The essence of understanding is free inquiry. The essence of freedom is the right to question. Questions are the essence of the night. So in reality, that's why I said like the answers don't really matter, because in reality, the essence of freedom is questioning. The essence of freedom is free inquiry. You know, think about oppressive regimes, and what is the number one thing that they do? They repress ideas. There's one idea, the idea of the leaders, and that is it. To be able to question something and challenge it, which is, I'm not a political scientist, but that's I think what democracy is based on, is, you know, the ability to do that. That's freedom. The ability to question what's going on in the world and to question ourselves. That's true freedom. You know, I think a lot about life choices, and specifically choosing like the years you go from high school to Israel to back here, like what life would be like, and then like living life, and like what life would be like if like I just continued life, and not like began to like think about questions and Judaism and things of that nature and things that we discuss here. Like, would I be happier? I would be in a kind of like oppressive self, which I think would be more free, because like the choice would kind of like go away, and I would, you know, stay on the train. But I always come to the conclusion that the struggle of the questions, of the personal questions and the collective Jewish questions and the world question and all these things, it always comes out as worth it on top, because whether I express it that way or not, free inquiry and questions are the essence of freedom, and that's the essence of the night. And that's why we want to extract from the Shem Show questions. Not because we like want him to talk, but we want him to be free. What we don't know is that he's free. He's the other side of the coin. We're coming at it from the collective Jewish people exterior freedom, which is equally important. When I'm using exterior here, I don't mean chitzoni in the superficial sense, in shitchi sense. I mean chitzoni in the world sense. What we fail to realize with that son who doesn't know how to ask is that he's contemplating, he's contemplative, he's internal. So we want him to be free with us, and the lesson that we need to take from him is collective freedom is great, but if it's just being the same as everyone else, it's not freedom. It's missing an important component of freedom. Once heard, I'm sure if you've hung around him for more than a second, like Reb Judah likes to say, I hope he doesn't listen to this, not because of this, just that shalom, peace, doesn't mean that everyone's the same. Wholeness means that you have a lot of parts that come together. When something breaks to 1,000 pieces, when you put it together, every piece came to make a whole, but no piece looks the same. People live in the delusion that peace and shleimus and personal collective redemption means I have to just like be the same as everyone else. But the beauty of the four sons is that they're all different. It's just four. I don't remember if it's like the Rebbe Rayatz or Rebbe Riskin, one of them. No, because he quotes him in his Agada, so I don't remember if it's him or. Hey, he cried when he told that story on Living Torah. It's on the web. You can check it out. When they talk about the 4 sons, they say it's just 4 different type of child in one family. Like, he points out the obvious. He says a little more, but like, everyone likes to touch it up in like their own way. You know, like the Russians knock his teeth out. His teeth is this. I don't even remember at this point. The best little vort I got, that's been rolling in my family Seder for years, was one year I said, Russia, this is Russia Tevos Ribono Shel Olam. And in mockery, everyone was like, for years has been mocking me. Like, Seder night, everyone's like, Ribono Shel Olam. But like, I think it's pretty cool. But my point is that one of them, I don't want to say I think it's Reb Rayatz, because like, he's Reb Rayatz, but I don't know who it is. They point out the obvious. It's just 4 different sons in one family, and people like to say, "Oh, they're like, yeah, the Chacham's the best because he's like the most yeshivish, you know, and the Sheni Lishol is worse because he's fry, you know." But like, in reality, like, that's a healthy family because each kid did their own thing and became their own person, and freedom and redemption and shleimus means that a family is able to exist with everyone who's different. You know, I get weirded out and queasy around like families that like everyone is like the same. You know, I don't know about you, but I do. But that's the essence of freedom, is the ability to like shake up the nest a little bit, to question and to challenge ourselves and to challenge the world order, to challenge from without and to challenge from within, and to ask the questions and not necessarily want any answers. And Rav Steinsaltz says it again. He just points out that we believe that the law has at least 600,000 different paths within it for individuals to enter. And it goes on, but the point is that there's 600,000 ways. These are like age-old ideas, and yet we forget them year after year. Us personally, and us collectively, forget these like notions of 600,000 different people or 12 gates of prayer. It's like everyone lives in this world of like the exterior of redemption is this. But if you turn it within, like, I have my redemption, he has his redemption, he has his redemption. That's, I think, what the Sheino the Elishol is bringing to the table, is reminding us that externally we could, who cares if people say that we're like Sheino the Elishol, so why don't you do this, why don't you do that? As long as internally we're thinking and questioning what's my purpose, what's my role. We could really just end here, but Eli Wiesel is pretty sweet. So I think it's pretty.
You got this at Strand.
I bought this with you at Strand, yeah. Starts on page 2. Basically says how it's like powerful because he's writing how he used to experience Pesach one way, and after the Holocaust, his love of the holiday is the same. It's still his favorite holiday, but yet his experience is totally different. Which, obviously, like the Holocaust was it, but the message, I think, also is for him telling us, like, we shouldn't enter Pesach with the same booklet of Torahs every year, the same mindset every year. If like, you know, it should always be matured and older a little bit. Let's see. Where is it? Okay. Here on top. Here I must interrupt my tale, for I see I am using the past tense. Why? Because none of this is true anymore, not all. The meaning of the festival and its rituals has scarcely changed, only I have changed. I still follow the rituals, of course. I recite the prayers, I chant the appropriate psalms, I tell the story of the Exodus. I answer the questions my son asks, from the deepest part of myself. I know it is not the same. It is not as it used to be. A lifetime separates me from the child I once was. Today I know that happiness can never be complete. The joyousness of this holiday is so tinged with melancholy that it seems more likely a time of sadness. There's a lot to that, I think. The notion of at least thinking about coming out of Yom Tov. and still being externally where we are. But I don't know, I obviously when you have an idea, you start to read everything and see everything in that lens. So when I was reading this, especially like right here, I was like, when he said that a lifetime separates from the child I once was, that it feels like there's that divide of a lifetime between the external and the internal, between the Chacham, Rasha, and Tam, and the Shein Odei Elishol, who are in the same family, but yet there seems like there's this wall between this contemplative, personal son and these like hip with it, get it guys. And there's like this wall. They're siblings, and they can't even realize they're just part of the same equation. But what he says, it is understandable Passover was the last holiday I celebrated at home. I recall this to explain why it is impossible for me to talk about Passover solely in the present tense. Do I love it less than before? No. Let's just say I love it differently. Now I love it for the questions it raises, which are, after all, its raison d'etre. What is most appealing about the Seder? Its challenge to children to ask questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because it reminds us of another night, so long ago, yet so near. The last night of persecuted and oppressed people, our people sent to Egypt. Why do we eat bitter herbs? Okay. It's the last end of that paragraph. The goal is to arouse our curiosity by opening the doors of memory. On this evening, all questions are not only permitted, but invited. Still, we begin by examining the traditional 4 questions, which illustrate 4 possible attitudes towards life. Shift over. And then there's my own English. What can we do as not to forget the question? What can we do to defeat the oblivion? What significance does Passover have, if not to keep our memories alive? To be Jewish is to assume the burden of the past, to include it in our concerns for the present and for the future. They're the questions that everyone asks, and they're the questions that I ask. They're the questions that were there to elicit questions or thought, and then there are the questions that aren't there. Just go to the 3rd page. If you skip down all the way, every year when he reached this place in the text, the celebrated Reb Eli Wiesel of Berditchev would stop to meditate. After a long silence, he would cry out, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 4th son who does not even know how to ask the question, that is me, Reb Yitzchak. If I knew how to ask questions, I would ask you these questions. Read them in my heart. Almighty God, they are waiting for you there. Then he goes into different questions. But the purpose is, the Shein Odei Elishol, the son who I titled is just waiting to ask, he's never going to express that personality. It's not talking about a specific person. Like, you are not this, or you are not that. We are attempting to be a synthesis of both ideas, the external and the internal, the questions that I can't express verbally, but are in my heart that I just want people to understand. That's why we feel so misunderstood, is because there are things inside us that cannot be expressed. But the essence of the night is questions. The essence of the night is freedom, which comes via those questions. And the whole, going back to the beginning, the purpose of acting like we're in Yetzias Mitzrayim, the memory of evoking an experience, is to feel the freedom that comes from these questions. Questions make us feel uncomfortable. They make us feel shattered, but they allow us to feel. And the mindset has to be that feeling is not a feeling of enslavement, but a feeling of freedom. The shattering, or the whatever we feel, however you experience it, is not slavery. We're in the mindset of slavery if we think the feeling that comes via questions in life is the feeling of slavery, but it's really the feeling of freedom. So it requires us to, I guess, change the way we view freedom. Because that will be hard till freedom is opportune. Thank you very much for listening.
Sure. Thanks.
Sounded like it, right? Thank you all for listening. I hope it was clear.
Very.
So much for notes. I don't think I read one word from this page. What do you guys think of notes?